Have you ever looked at a painting like the ones behind me and you can see some really interesting marks and almost like a snowflake pattern, like in this cow's ear or on the belly of those Canada geese? You think, well, how do they do that? Or, well, maybe you already know the answer, and it's using salt with watercolour. Perhaps you've tried it and really not had a lot of success and been a bit frustrated. Well, stick around and I'm going to share a few tips on what to do and a few things just to avoid. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a professional watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I bring you a tip, trick or technique that I wish somebody had told me when I started painting. And this week it's all about using salt with your watercolours. So just before we actually get into the salt, I thought we could take a slightly closer look at this painting and see how you can actually use salt in your work. I mean, I love using it for feather techniques, for feather textures, to give the impression of all that downy feather. But it's great for foliage on trees. It can be super in backgrounds. But the one thing I would warn you about is just overusing it. You do tend to see it an awful lot in pictures, and if it doesn't make sense, if it's not bringing something to the party, don't do it. Time for a little scientific test. I've got hot pressed here, cold pressed there, divided into 4, and we are going to test ordinary table salt, Epsom salts, pink Himalayan salt, very posh, and some dishwasher salt. Now both the pink Himalayan salt and the dishwasher salt I've slightly crushed because the crystals were so big I thought they would probably just bounce off. So you've got to wait till it, this is just the table salt, wait till the sheen starts to go off, and that was already starting to dry. Let's put the Epsom in. The pink, so we've got different size crystals here, some of them are still a bit big, and this is the crushed dishwasher salt. So again, see, that's what I was worried about. See what that does. So let's get to our cold pressed here. I'm using dioxazine, I can never say that, Diox purple, because my experience tells me this works really well with salt usually. Now, there's always a day when it won't, because what you will find is that salt technique can be an unpredictable beast. When you need it to work really well, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes when you think, oh, that's not going to do anything, it works beautifully. So anyway, this Diox purple generally should be pretty good. So again, we just need to let that soak into the paper a little until the sheen starts to go off it. If you put it in the moment that you put the paint on, when it's very wet, it just won't play ball. You'll just end up with a wet, soggy pile of salty water. If you wait too long, it just the paint can't move because it's too dry, and it's just sit on the surface and do nothing. So I'm waiting a couple of minutes. I think we're probably okay now. Timing is crucial. So there's the table salt. Here are the Epsom salts. Again with the crushed Himalayan, and have a few different size bits. That's maybe a bit much, I've been enthusiastic there. It is a sprinkle, it's not a crusting of salt, we're not baking fish here. And there is the dishwasher. Now I'm going to turn this on to time lapse so that you do not have to sit for the next half hour. So once the salt's on the surface, just leave it alone, don't fiddle, and let it do its thing. So these have all dried now, and I think it's immediately obvious that the effect of the salt is far better on the cold pressed or the not surface. It has worked on the hot press, but not as well, and that actually surprises me. I thought because the paint would sit on the surface of the paper more that you'd actually get a better effect. I don't use hot press, or very, very rarely, so I wasn't sure. Hey, I've learnt something. I think you can also see, if we look specifically on that cold press paper, that actually all the salts work nicely. I would expect to have a slightly more round mark with the Epsom salts. That's what I've always found, and they are slightly rounder. The table salt works really well, and you can see where large bits of the both the pink and the dishwasher salt have been, and they leave little rings, so that's something to think about. You need to remove all the salt once it's properly dry, because otherwise it'll carry on absorbing water from the atmosphere and can actually re-wet your paint if you're not careful. So I think that's been really useful. Basically, use the cheapest salt you want and use cold press paper. Right, time to test out a few colours, and it's just a good idea to swatch out some of your favourites and see what they do, because you can be really surprised, and sometimes they just don't play ball and sometimes they do all sorts of yummy things. Okay, all our colour swatches are dry, and this is really interesting. Now, from experience, I was thoroughly expecting the cadmiums not to play ball. They usually just sit and sulk and look at you if you put salt on them. However, this cadmium yellow has in fact behaved itself. Who knew? Yeah, sorry about the confusion. I put Quin Gold where I meant to put the burnt sienna and vice versa. Now, again, in my experience, Quin Gold usually does really nicely with salt, and it hasn't particularly this time, which I guess is one of those, salt is a fickle beast. So I'm surprised the cad yellow's so nice. I'm not surprised about the cad red. Really surprised about alizarin, because again, usually alizarin plays pretty nicely. Not surprised about the French ultramarine. That doesn't usually take a really good texture in my experience. Prussian blue is always a really good one. The Quins usually are very good, so I had Quin Sienna and Quin Magenta, and they both behaved themselves nicely. I told you Diox Purple is a really reliable one, and again, you've got those beautiful marks. Phthalo Green, I know that's a good one. I'm actually surprised how nicely the burnt umber has taken that texture, because on the whole my experience is that the inorganic pigments, so like the Quins and the Phthalos, always take salt texture very well, whereas the earth pigments I generally don't find as cooperative. But actually here, say the burnt sienna and the burnt umber they've behaved themselves, which is lovely. Say French ultramarine never does. Of course it granulates beautifully, but just doesn't take the salt. If you've got a usual palette of colours that you love to use, it's probably worth checking them out. This isn't foolproof, because I say that shouldn't have happened. So that could have been I just didn't get my timing right. Or indeed there was a tea in the day, or it can be very temperamental. But do this and you'll start to know which ones you can rely on to play along, which ones are never going to play, and which ones might be a little bit temperamental.